everyone, it's Simon Smart from the CPX podcast. I'm talking today with Greg Clark and John Dixon. We're talking about a scandal that rocked at least the eastern states in the last couple of weeks, when some high-profile rugby league players were caught up in a group sex scandal involving a 19-year-old girl. It was from 7 years ago, but it re-emerged in an ABC Four Corners program that unearthed some what people have found to be rather disturbing aspects of that rugby league culture. But the reaction of the community generally to this has been far and wide and deep. I wonder what you make of all of that, Greg.
Yeah, it has been incredible to see the reaction. I mean, there's been all sorts of reactions, but it blew the budget off the front page. You know, sex is far more media-worthy than money, obviously. I've seen the whole range of reactions from the sort of things that I've read and heard on the radio, from one extreme point of view where people are saying, well, this involved obviously a loose woman who was just out to have fun with whoever she could find and there was nothing illegal going on. That's been one extreme. Through to the other reaction of, you know, how did these blokes ever think that this was something that they ought to be doing, this is something that was normal human sexual behaviour?
Did it surprise you, John, that the reaction was so deep to this?
I think it clearly illustrates that the moral muscle of Australians is still there, ready to be flexed when we need it. So you got a sense of this incredible moral outrage, that the compass of Australian morality was pointing true north.
Then there was the other kind of spin on that, wasn't there? People saying, well, you can't tell us how to live. Like, let's leave morality for individuals to sort out.
And there was the whole question of whether, even if it was immoral, who are we to pry into the lives of these figures? We wouldn't do it for any non-public figure, so why do we do it for a public figure? So it raised the question of sort of public standards and what should be the standards of our heroes in various areas of life.
It was really like a public hanging of this particular individual who was at the centre of it all. That again brought different reactions. Some people felt, yes, he deserved to lose his position. He's someone who has influence in the community and certainly would have had influence on the players at the time. But on the other hand, some said, well, you know, he deserved it. What was not your personal reaction, but what did you make of that?
Well, I think if the player had been far more apologetic, like profoundly apologetic, not just sorry that it had happened and sorry for the harm caused to his wife and so on, but actually admitted that this demeaned people, it demeaned sexuality and so on, and was sorry for that, Australians might have been more willing to embrace. So I think there is an Australian culture, not only this moral outrage that can sort of appear to come from nowhere, there is a sense in which Australians are happy to give people a second go if they mea culpa. If they say, hang on, I really was, this was a terrible act. I'm not just sorry for the people I've hurt.
That was missing, and people have said it was missing. Even he gave two apologies, one very weak in the first instance and then another when the game was really up. But even then, people discerned that he wasn't quite getting what the community were upset about.
And so that's what I'm saying. That fed the outrage part of Australian mentality.
I think when you notice someone's defensive and protective, you say, hang on, there's more of a story here, and dig deeper, and trying to get blood out of a stone when it came to this. It's
a little bit complex, though, isn't it? I felt like he was trying to defend his actions by saying he didn't do anything illegal. Others were wanting to say, yes, but you did something immoral. There's a bit of a gap between those two things, isn't there? And that seemed to be an area that he didn't comprehend.
Well, I couldn't work out from what he'd said whether he thought people were accusing him of doing something immoral. And part of what confused it early on is that there were very early interviews with people from the Rape Crisis Centre. Yeah?
Yes.
And so that suddenly raised the question, I think, in a lot of Australians, oh, hang on, did he rape this girl? When you've got the rape crisis expert on the radio. So maybe he was sort of reacting to that feeling. I don't know, but it is an interesting question. Sure, you might not have done anything illegal, but there is a moral question here going on.
The whole question of consent has been part of the debate, isn't it? It's interesting how I think in our society now we try to work out how you should behave according to these different principles. One was consent. If everyone was happy to do this, then what's the problem? There's been a big question mark over consent in this case, especially for the woman involved, but I imagine also for many of the blokes there, the kind of who actually knew what was going on in this situation. That, I think, has thrown a lot of dust in the air for people. What does it mean to really consent to these behaviours in a culture where there's so much pressure, there's alcohol involved, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, some would say even if the consent was given, was this person in a position to give a clear-headed decision? These men came into the room who she hadn't asked to do so. There ended up being 12 of them in the room. There's a great power imbalance there. So even if she didn't say no, stop, some have felt that, look, clearly she wasn't in a position to protest.
In my opinion, consent's kind of meaningless in that situation. It just doesn't make sense. The other one that's interesting, I read an article about someone who said, well, actually, it should be about pleasure. If everyone's having a good time here, then that's fine. And the problem with that kind of group sex situation is it's kind of hard to imagine that everyone's having a good time. Certainly, women in that situation usually report this is not much fun, especially later on.
I was about to say, even if it was completely consensual, and there weren't these power imbalances, which there clearly were, but even if there weren't these power imbalances, it was entirely pleasurable. It raises a question about what happens weeks, months later when the moral reflection of the individuals involved kicks in. It isn't really about pleasure and the moment. You can have enjoyed something, consented to something that on reflection you understand to be incredibly demeaning. And that seems to have happened
so pleasure in the moment doesn't translate to something beautiful and in a lasting sense.
No, it can't.
And certainly the regret is clearly there in the case of this woman who became suicidal and very depressed over the whole thing and reported that on the Four Corners program. But Greg, is there something about sexuality that makes this type of thing so emotive, and is there something that about what it is to be human that we're seeing reflected in these sorts of discussions?
Well, I think that's the really interesting thing here is we're getting down to the kind of moral questions, and by that we don't mean laws right and wrong. You'd expect the Christians to come out and say something prudish about any kind of sexual behaviour that doesn't fit the kind of missionary position, sex manual that we've all been taught. Yeah, but that's not the case at all. When we talk about moral, we mean what's good for human beings here. What's a good way for human beings to relate in the area of sex? And I think we're just seeing in the general population now people raising questions, going, "Hang on, is this actually in any way good for human beings? Is there something? Are we just mammals? That song, "We're nothing but mammals." Do we really believe that? Or is that going too far? I think that's the really interesting question here.
It is, and I think what we find here is the reduction of sex to the physicality. And so if sex really is just a physical thing with no sort of emotional, spiritual connections, that would lead us to one conclusion about these events. But if, as most of us suspect, we are more than mammals, that sex is more than just breeding, sex is actually a kind of psychological
it's a deep connection,
spiritual thing, yeah. Then actually you have done something. So a trauma has occurred. A beautiful thing has been tarnished. And this, I think, brings us very close to the biblical view of sex, which all of us have a hunch about. But, the Bible is explicit about sex being a wonderful thing. There's a whole book of the Bible about it. But being so precious, that's why there has to be some care taken in how sex is used.
John, you mentioned Song of Songs, that book about sex, and it's fascinating because it is very physical, real exploration of bodies and pleasures and so forth, but in a long, loving, interpersonal way. It's not the kind of book that matches that kind of scene, group sex in a hotel room, is it? There's a real mismatch there.
Well, one of the sort of counterbalances in the Song of Songs is this theme of, do not awaken love before it's time. There's a sense in which all of the erotic sensations that are clearly there in the book have to be balanced with proper restraint at the proper time. And if there's no restraint in the sexual activity and in sexual pleasure, then you actually diminish sex. But when there is context and restraint and honouring of the other, sex comes alive even more.
I think people get the Bible backwards on this. They think the Bible's just saying, don't do this, don't do that, like cutting you off from all the fun stuff. But it's actually trying to say, this is the best way. This is the most fulfilling way for both people involved. Yeah.
Well, I hate to quote one of my very early books, but this is a story.
I won't stop you. Go ahead.
Yeah, it won't. In a sneaking suspicion, I pinched this illustration from another preacher, but now everyone thinks it's my illustration. That I owned a Datsun 1200 as my first car, and because it only cost me $1,200 and I didn't really respect it, I lent it out to all my friends, which is quite a dangerous thing to do. But if I'd been given a Porsche or something like that, you can be sure that I'd be far more careful with it, because the things you value, the more sort of restrained you are about how far and wide you lend it out. And I think, the point is, the Bible's view of sex is very high, more like a Porsche than a Datsun.
Is there something, though, a bit broader in the discussion, and one of the reasons it perhaps brought so much comment from all the journos and so on, and that is this culture, perhaps. They were perhaps not wanting to just focus on this one person. No one thinks he's alone in this, or that this sort of thing doesn't go on, not only in sport but elsewhere. Is there this sort of sense that they're trying to attack a culture that has a particular attitude to women and perhaps male aggression or team bonding and this sort of thing? Is it, Greg, you're a big rugby league fan, is it a rugby league particular problem?
You set me up there. Yeah, I do go for the Bunnies, but and we did have a good win on the weekend. No, I prefer cricket, but look, hey, I don't think the cricketers are necessarily in a different category to the league players, nor are the academics, nor are the lawyers, nor are the doctors. No one, no one escapes the kind of question marks over how we behave in the sexual arena. I think it can be true, though, that blokes in particular can get egged on together in certain directions, and it takes leadership and courage to move people in a direction you think is good, to stand up and say, actually, I don't like what's going on here. It's not cool. Guys, let's stop it. Yeah, the leaders, the natural leaders, have some responsibility there, whatever field they're from, because they know others will follow them.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if this particular player emerges as that kind of leader, as someone who's able to just profoundly admit wrongdoing and try and lead the way? That could be a beautiful thing.
I'd love to see that kind of story of redemption and turnaround, because that seems to be what God's on about all the time.
Can I just throw something else into the mix? Just by coincidence, you guys know that in our CPX staff meeting this morning, we read John chapter 8 and the famous story of the woman caught in adultery and the woman brought before Jesus, and Jesus says, the person without sin cast the first stone. And Jesus ends by saying, no one's condemned you, I don't condemn you either, go and leave your life of sin. Very, beautiful, profound story. Does this have anything to say about this particular case? Can I throw that back to you guys?
Well, don't we love Jesus for his kind of wisdom there to say, look at yourself. If you want to stone this woman for the things she's done wrong, look at yourself.
Or this man in our case.
Or this man, look at yourself, that's right, yeah. But the end of the story is so important too, isn't it? That it's not only look at yourself, don't judge others because you come under the same judgment, but it's also turn away from that stuff. Find a better way.
Yeah, Jesus seems to have been able to hold in beautiful balance a strong love and forgiveness toward the sinner, to use theological language, and yet without ever compromising the moral question. I don't know how many Christians can hold that balance. I don't know how well Australian society can hold that balance either.
It's something very beautiful and rich in it. It gives us something to aspire to, no matter how far we all fall short of it at the moment.